In this lesson, we'll debug the problem that we saw at the end of the previous lesson. For some reason, when we defined a handle click method and we provided a reference to that method for our onClick handler on our button, we saw that the code was not executing properly. So the reason why this is occurring is due to the very fickle nature of the this keyword in JavaScript. So just as a quick reminder, the this keyword refers to the object or the context on which a specific method is invoked. Another way that I can say that is what this is depends on how that keyword is being used throughout your program. It's actually one of the most confusing features of JavaScript, and that is that that actual keyword varies throughout the program depending on the way that it is utilized. So in order to show you that, what I want to do is console log the value of this in all three of our methods, our constructor, our handle click, and our render. And you're going to see that it's not actually going to be equal in those three different occurrences. So right here in our constructor, I'm just going to console log this. And in handle click, I'm going to console log this. In fact, to make this a little bit more descriptive, let's actually tell ourselves where we are. So right here, I'm going to say in constructor, just so we know in our console exactly where this printing is going on. So in constructor, and right here I will say in handle click, and we'll print out the value of this. And right here in my render method, I will console log in render and also output this. And we can provide consecutive arguments to console log, and they will all just be printed sequentially. So let me clear the console here. Let me refresh the page. And here we can see in the constructor, we have this referring to our app component, and that is exactly what we want. And that is what allows us to, for example, set state correctly, because that state property is going to exist on our React app component. So this is correct. You can see in the render method, it's also the reference to the app component. More specifically, the this keyword is referencing the app component. So in that context, for example, that app component is what's going to have a set state method available on it, which is why we were able to get away with an inline arrow function 2 lessons ago. And the reason we're not yet seeing the console log on line 11 is because that code hasn't run yet, because our handle click hasn't been triggered by a button click. So now take a look at what happens when I click log into account. We do have the output in the console log, which means we are successfully entering that method and running it. But you'll see in the handle click method, the value of the this keyword is undefined. And that is a huge problem. And that is exactly what the error is on line 12, React and JavaScript tried to call the setState method not on the actual app component, not on that object that actually has the setState method on it, but rather on the undefined primitive value in JavaScript. And of course, undefined does not have a setState method available, so the whole program falls apart. And that's exactly what the error message is here. It says, cannot read properties of undefined reading setState. What that basically says is with the dot syntax on line 12, we were trying to access a property or a method called setState on this, but JavaScript cannot read any properties from the undefined data type from the undefined value. And thus it says, I don't even know what this is. This doesn't exist. And that's how the crash happens. So the key takeaway here is that the context or the meaning of the this keyword has been lost here somehow, right? We have been unable to preserve what this is. And this in the body of the handle click method should still be the reference to the instance, to the actual app object, to the object that's going to be created from this class, from this blueprint. And somehow that has been lost. So let me show you the first way that we can fix this issue. I will be honest with you, it's not the most elegant solution, but it is a valid solution, and it is what you would see in React code bases when this issue was first introduced. In the next lesson, I'll show you the more modern way to solve this problem, but that requires us to have more modern build tools, specifically Webpack and Babel. So this solution was actually the way that people solved this problem a couple of years ago, back when React was more in its infancy. So let's begin with removing all these console logs because we don't need them. And our solution is actually going to take place entirely within the constructor right here. So I'm going to write the syntax, and then we're going to talk about what it's doing because it's a little bit confusing. I'm going to write this.handleClick, which you'll notice is the exact same name as the method down below. And on the right-hand side of an equal sign, I will say this dot handle click dot bind, invoke that, which is a function in JavaScript, and pass in this right here. This syntax can be very confusing, but the good news about the syntax is it is universal whenever you run into this problem in React. So if you are ever defining a class-based React component and for some reason the this keyword is not correctly defined within a method, it's as simple as writing this.method equals this.method.bind, passing in this. So once you memorize this pattern, it's the same solution each time. So while it may be confusing, at some point you just kind of memorize it and commit it to memory and replicate it. But more importantly than recognizing the memory part, let's talk about what exactly this is doing. So as we know in JavaScript, the right side of an equal sign is evaluated first. So the first thing JavaScript looks at is this. And this code, of course, is going to run in the constructor when the component is rendered, when this object is instantiated from the class. So this reference to this.handleClick is actually a reference to the defined handleClick method below. So even though the constructor method is placed above in the class, JavaScript understands its execution environment and it understands all of the available methods within our class body. So this.handleClick is simply referencing this uninvoked method right here, the exact same way that we are referencing it on line 25. Then that method, any method in JavaScript, in fact, or any function as well, has a method available on it called bind. So bind is a method that we invoke on a function or a method. It's kind of weird, right? Because we're used to invoking methods on things like arrays and objects, right? But we can actually invoke methods on functions because in JavaScript, functions are also objects. So you can think of this as a function, as a recipe for some procedure, for something that's going to happen. And on that actual construct in JavaScript, we can invoke a method called bind. What bind will do is it will return a new version of that existing function or method that bind is called on, but it's going to provide a specific value for what this will be when that function or method executes. So what we are binding is the context of this. To bind simply means to connect. So the reason the method is called bind is because we're connecting this function to what this should be when it executes. So we can pass in any kind of object we want in here. So for example, if I simply passed in an empty object, then this empty object would be what this would be if handleClick was called later on. But we don't want to pass in an empty object. We want to pass in the actual app component. And as we saw earlier with the console logs, within the body of our constructor, we know that this is correctly referencing the app component, correctly referencing the instance. So because we know that this object is the one we want, we are saying JavaScript, take this function or method and rebind it, redefine the context of what this should be. And that is what the argument to the bind method is. And what we're passing in as the argument is this, which we know in the constructor is the correct context. It is the app object. It is the app component. So basically this kind of reformats or redesigns this existing method so that this is correctly applied when it runs in here. But the problem is what bind does is it returns a brand new function / method. So it's going to be created, but it's not going to do anything because it's just going to live in the constructor, right? It's no different than if we just declare some kind of function right here, right? It's going to be gone as soon as it's done executing. So what we do after that is once we have that new bound version of the handleClick method, we overwrite the existing handleClick method with the bound version. That means we keep all the logic of what's going on in handleClick. The only thing that's changed with the binding is what this will be. So rather than this being undefined, which is the default behavior that we saw at the start of this lesson and at the end of the previous one, now when handleClick executes, it will execute with this being set to this argument right here, which we know to be the app component. So it's almost like saying here, this is now going to be app.setState or our app component.setState instead of being undefined setState. That's what the bind method does. It defines what this thing will be before the actual method that is invoked. So if all of that was confusing, don't worry for two reasons. Number one, because if it's confusing, just memorize the syntax. This.method name equals this.method name.bind, passing in this. And this logic is always going to be in the constructor. So in older React code bases where this logic is repeated, you might just see a whole bunch of methods written in order with the exact same syntax. But the second reason I don't want you to worry about is because there is a more elegant solution that we'll explore in the next lesson. Once again, I wanted to introduce you to this one because it was the way we solved things, 5 or 6 years ago. And this was using built-in JavaScript features that were available to the language. Even before ES6, JavaScript has a lot of really weird quirks, and this keyword is one of them. And so this is an issue that is not specific to React. It's actually a vanilla JavaScript issue and requires a lot of kind of deeper knowledge of how the language works and all of its weird eccentricities. With all that said, this will fix the issue because now this keyword right here will correctly be the app component instead of undefined. So if I clear my console and refresh the page, and I click log into account, we get the exact same result as when we had an inline arrow function on line 25. We correctly change the value of the text property on state, which triggers a re-render. We always get a re-render whenever we use the setState method. And that, of course, replaces the internal button text to be register. All right. So same logic as we had, just more isolated. And that is the primary reason why some developers take this approach, is because it allows us to move more of the JavaScript specific logic away from the JSX in the render method. Right now, this is just one line of code, so it isn't particularly offensive. But if you had a lot of logic here, like 10 lines, putting those 10 lines of logic in an inline arrow function in the middle of our JSX is kind of jarring because it's just two different concerns. It's just a bunch of HTML-like syntax along with a whole bunch of JavaScript, which can be confusing. So a lot of times developers just provide references to instance methods, which allow us to write the JavaScript elsewhere in the component and just have a much cleaner separation of those responsibilities. All right. So with that said, in the next lesson, I will show you a much more elegant solution to this problem, and it's the one I prefer and use today. So this is just a little bit of history for you, and we'll see the more modern solution in the next lesson. I'll see you there.